the hands that healed and hurt. In the city where skyscrapers kissed the smog-smeared heavens and the streets pulsed with 1,000 untold stories, Dr. Elias Rhys stood at the edge of a miracle. 32, fresh-faced yet sharp-eyed, Elias was the kind of doctor you only read about in fiction, one whose hands danced with precision, whose heart beat in sync with his patients. He carried a kind of quiet fire, one that flickered not for ambition, but for the sanctity of life itself. St. Ivana General, a place that smelled of antiseptic and hope, was where he spent most of his waking hours. On a particularly stormy Thursday, when rain hammered the windows like a desperate fist, he was called in for an emergency unlike any other. Lucien Valle, the billionaire whose name adorned half the hospitals in the city, and whose face was splashed across magazines like a brand of royalty, had collapsed at a gala. Massive cardiac arrest. By the time they wheeled him in, his complexion had turned the shade of week-old parchment, and his pulse was a whisper on the edge of silence. Elias, unshaken, cracked his knuckles like a pianist preparing for a symphony and dove into the chaos. Nurses moved like synchronized shadows, machines beeped like anxious birds, and the overhead lights buzzed with judgment. The surgery was delicate, involving an experimental stent placement technique that had only been approved a week prior. It was bold, risky, beautiful. After 5 hours, Lucien lived. He was pale and groggy, but alive, and the city called it a miracle. Elias was hailed as the sculptor of second chances in the morning papers. Strangers sent flowers. Patients requested him by name. But 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. Lucien Valle versus Elias Rhys. Malpractice. Gross negligence. Unapproved procedure. Elias read the words again and again, each syllable a dagger dipped in disbelief. Lucien, now resting in his penthouse, lined with Egyptian cotton and Italian marble, claimed the surgery had left him with occasional double vision and minor tremors. Symptoms that, while mild, were apparently unacceptable for a man who sealed billion-dollar deals with a handshake and a stare. The trial played out like a grotesque play. In the courtroom, Lucien wore a sleek gray suit and an expression carved from ice. His lawyers painted Elias as an overzealous novice who played God. They talked of protocols and approvals, of legal frameworks and liability clauses. They whispered of ambition cloaked in compassion. Elias sat quietly, fingers clenched, heart heavy. He tried to speak of the night, of the rain, of the way Lucien's heart had stuttered like a broken metronome. He tried to tell them about the choices, the only choices that would have meant life or death. But his words, though true, fell like feathers in a thunderstorm. The verdict? Guilty. Not criminally, but enough to ruin him. His license was suspended, fines, public apology, media disgrace. Lucien Valle walked away, polished shoes tapping against the marble floor like a victory drum. Elias walked out the back, beneath a leaking awning, into a city that no longer remembered he once held a dying man's heart in his hands and made it beat again. Years passed. Elias found a quiet town by the sea where no one knew his name. He opened a small clinic above a flower shop, tended to broken wrists and sore throats, smiled at children and watched sunsets bleed gold over the waves. But in the evenings, when the wind whispered through the cracked shutters, he'd stare at his hands, those traitorous, blessed hands, and remember the man he saved and the man who turned healing into harm. The wind howled outside like an old ghost, dragging its regrets across the shore. In his modest cottage above the clinic, Elias sat by the fireplace, a mug of untouched tea cooling between his palms. The salt in the air had become part of his lungs, and the ocean's rhythm had replaced the frantic beeping of heart monitors in his ears. Life here was quieter, softer, but it never quite filled the hollowness that Lucien Valle had carved into him like a surgeon with cruel hands. He still read medical journals, still watched the sunrise with the curiosity of someone who knew too much about what the body could and could not do. But most of all, he watched for letters, not from patients, but from ghosts. One evening, as gulls cried above the pier and the light turned the sea into spilled copper, a girl stumbled into the clinic. Barely 16, freckled with tear-streaked cheeks and a limp that screamed pain. She clutched her abdomen and whispered one word before collapsing. "Help!" Instinct overtook him like muscle memory. In seconds, Elias was beside her, lifting her with a gentleness honed by years of doubt and exile. The room became a theater again. The blood, the trembling hands, the racing clock. She had a ruptured appendix, and the local hospital was an hour away over winding roads. He couldn't wait. The old tools, still polished with care and wrapped in cloth like sacred relics, came out. He worked with a fevered grace, stitching her back together beneath a single buzzing light bulb while the sea hurled itself against the cliffs below. She lived. Her name was Margot. Her mother, a weathered woman with eyes the color of burnt leaves, wept into his coat when she heard. Word spread through the town like fire through dry grass. Whispers of the doctor who saved her. Again and again they came. Farmers, fishermen, the baker with the bad hip, the librarian who couldn't sleep, and Elias, humbled and haunted, healed in silence. But fate is a wheel, and wheels always return. One winter morning, years after Margot's surgery, a black car rolled into town. It didn't belong. It gleamed like sin. And from it stepped a man whose face Elias knew as intimately as his own reflection. Lucien Vale. Older now, thinner. His eyes no longer cold but hollow, like tunnels with no light at the end. He walked with a cane, his handshake trembled. He didn't speak until Elias offered him tea, and they sat on opposite ends of a table built from driftwood and resolve. "I was wrong," Lucien said, voice brittle. "They told me it was you or death. I chose life. Then I chose pride." Elias said nothing. He studied the man like a specimen, how regret hunched his shoulders, how the weight of unspoken apology curled in his knuckles. "I have Parkinson's," Lucien continued. "They think the tremors were a warning, not a consequence. I sued the only man who saved me." Silence stretched between them like an old bridge threatening to collapse. "I can't fix what I broke," Lucien said, "but I wanted you to know I remember what you did. I remember the rain and how you didn't hesitate." Still, Elias said nothing. Lucien stood to leave, his cane tapping a slow, uneven rhythm toward the door. Then Elias spoke, softly as if afraid the words might crumble. "Do you still believe in miracles, Mr. Vale?" Lucien paused, hand on the doorknob. "No," he said, "but I believe in redemption." Elias looked out the window to the horizon where sea met sky in a kiss that never ended. "I don't," he replied, "but I believe in starting again." And with that, the door closed. The tide came in, and somewhere beyond the roar of the surf and the sigh of old pain, a young girl named Margot laughed in the distance, alive, whole, a testament to a doctor who had lost everything and still chose to heal.